everyone, my name's Katrina Walser from Oliphant and I am a knitting teacher and designer based in Sydney in Australia. And welcome to my monthly podcast on the needles. So before we begin, in the spirit of reconciliation, I'd like to pay my respects to the traditional owners of the land on which I stand, the Darug people. I pay my respects to their elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people today. So it is the middle of February and this is episode 17 of my podcast. Now, I skipped December and January's podcast episodes. Sorry about that. I didn't mean to make anyone freak out that I had actually decided to stop filming, but there were a couple of reasons for it. So, first off, if you are new here, welcome. I always forget to say welcome to the new people. Thank you so much for being here. I am changing the format up a little bit today compared to what I normally do. So I'm going to actually do some housekeeping and life updates first. So if you're new, I would recommend, if you don't want to listen to my boring life updates about a life you don't know anything about, feel free to skip forward to the knitting. I will put a bookmark down below for when the talk about the FOs and the whips starts. And so just go ahead, listen to that instead of me nattering on about my life. But before you do, please make sure to like and subscribe if you enjoy what you see here, just because that helps YouTube show it to more people. For those of you who are interested in the life updates, the reason that I skipped the January podcast is that I ended up having a really busy December and January, in a large part because the job that I mentioned at the end of last podcast episode that I was meant to start at the beginning of January, I decided not to go forward with it. So it was very exciting and I was really grateful for the opportunity, but I realized that a startup was just not where I needed to be right now. So I had been working with them for the last 6 months in like a contracting position. So I did have some work I needed to wrap up with them before I rolled off the project. So I had a really busy January just wrapping up with them. And so it ended up just being too hectic to think about anything else except finishing up the job. So what that does mean is that I have a lot of stuff to show you today, like a lot, because I ended up doing a lot of knitting in December and January. And also, it does mean that I'm sort of in between jobs at the moment because I wrapped up the Oliphant cat stuff to start my new job, but then I also now don't have that job. So I don't know what I want to be doing next, which I'm pretty lucky. I know that I have some time that I can take to stop and think about what I actually want to do. So I'm going to take that time, probably a month or two, just to sit and figure out if I want to go back to working at Oliphant Cat full time, if I want to go back into tech, not too sure. But I will keep doing the podcast. I did decide that much. So for those of you who commented on the last episode, thank you so much. I really, really appreciated it. It's just so nice hearing that people are actually watching and that you do like the stuff that I've been making, both the knitting and the videos. Yeah, it's just nice to hear from you all. So thank you so much for commenting. I will get around to actually replying. And I do just, thank you for being here. I did make one video. So I did make my Everything That I Knit in 2022 video. And so if you missed that, I will post a link to it up here in the corner, or there's links to it in the description below. It ended up being a bit of a doozy. I knit more than I realized in 2022. There were a lot of FOs. So feel free to go check that out if you haven't seen it yet. The other thing, like housekeeping thing that I wanted to mention is that I've been watching my old videos back. I realized that I talk really differently on camera than I do in real life. I sound a lot more boring on the camera. I don't know, it's hard to describe, but I talk a lot more slowly. And a lot more, it comes across a bit more flat. So I'm trying to be a bit more natural now and just speak like I normally speak. What that means for you guys though is that I will probably be talking way faster than you're used to me talking. Because honestly, this is the speed at which I normally talk. I did have a coffee earlier today, so that may be contributing to it. But this is just how I speak in real life. So feel free to play with the speed settings on YouTube. I know I've had some friends tell me that they normally listen to me on 2x speed, so you may want to dial that back down to 1.5. And if you normally listen to me talking like at the sort of sedate pace that I was using previously, you can slow it down a little bit. So YouTube lets you play with the speed settings quite a bit. So feel free to listen to me at whatever speed multiplier you need to actually be comprehensible. Okay, so that is all of the housekeeping stuff. So let's just go in with all the whips and FOs because I've got a lot. So the first FO that I have is a Christmas pillow. And so this just goes to show how long it's been since I podcasted because I'm still talking about Christmas. So here's my Christmas pillow cover. If you want any details on the front panel, so the mosaic knitting and how all that works and stuff, I went over that quite a bit in the previous episode. So I recommend you go check that out. So at the end of last episode, I already had this front bit with the mosaic knitting done. So this was done in Heirloom Merino Magic Chunky for the green and BWM 8-ply Classic in cream, I think, for the white. Not classic, luxury. And I held the white double just so that the weight was a little bit more close to the chunky gauge or weight of the green yarn. Now, the thing that I did since the last episode is that I added the back panel, and it was a little bit interesting in the end. So I had initially wanted to just sew a material panel onto the back just to make it easier and faster, but I went through my material stash and I didn't really have any material that I liked that matched the rest of the cover. So I decided to knit the back panel in the end. Now, mosaic knitting gauge is very different to garter stitch gauge, which is what I wanted to use for the back panel. And I didn't want to do a swatch in the garter stitch. So what I ended up doing was making the back bottom bit a corner to corner sort of deal. So the way that I did it is that I picked up a couple, I think maybe 3 stitches here in this bottom corner, and I started knitting back and forth diagonally, and on the edges of each row, I would pick up a stitch from the edge of the front panel. So essentially I was increasing 1 stitch on either end, and that's how you do a corner to corner knit anyway. You start very small and you increase on the edges. So it worked out really nicely because the increase that I was doing was just picking up along the edges of the side of the front panel and also along the bottom of the front panel, so it grew that way. So I just kept doing that until I got it to be as tall as I wanted, and then I started working across the top flat and just kept picking up here across the bottom. So the way in a corner to corner panel that you stop growing it and just let it work flat is that, let me show you, I'll just undo these buttons. So once you hit this top edge here, where you are happy with the height, what you do is that instead of increasing along this edge, you start decreasing. And so you decrease along this edge where you want it to stay flat, and you keep increasing along the bottom edge where you're already increasing. And then that way the stitch count stays the same along this part where you're just sort of working flat across the top. And then to go down to the other corner on the other side, you start decreasing along the top and along the side. So with the decreases on the side, what I ended up doing was I kept picking up stitches from the side here, but then I did lots of decreases to make sure the stitch count was getting smaller along the edge. So that's the general gist of how you do a corner to corner panel. I know that wasn't very useful if you want to actually follow along, but there are lots of instructions online about how you can actually make a corner to corner rectangle. And the advantage of doing that, basically the reason I did that, was because that way I didn't need to know exactly how many stitches to cast on along the bottom to make sure the width was correct. Because I just sort of kept growing it until it was as big as I wanted it to be, then I could just sort of start off and keep going until the size was what I needed it to be. So that's why I did it corner to corner. Now, for the top bit, I ended up not doing it corner to corner, partially because I didn't mind it being a little bit wider at the top, because when you make an envelope pillow like this, the top part needs to be a little bit wider anyway so that it fits over the bottom panel properly, because there is a little bit of overlap between the bottom bit and the top bit so that it can close up. And so for the top bit, I just kept knitting on the end of the mosaic panel until it was as long as I wanted it to be, and then I just crocheted the edges shut here on the sides. So yeah, that's my corner to corner pillow. It was good, but I think something about the construction meant that it ended up being a little more floppy than I'm used to pillow cushion covers being. So it doesn't have a whole lot of structural integrity. I put the cushion cover directly onto the insert without another cover underneath, and ended up looking a bit like a potato sack, which was very strange. So if you saw earlier, the reason that there's this stripy stuff underneath is that I don't bother taking the other cushion cover off anymore. I just put the Christmas pillow cover over whatever cushion cover I've already got and just cover it up. And that way it retains a little bit of structural integrity. And yeah, it was lovely and fun for Christmas. The next FO I have is my pink summer top. Guys, oh my goodness. So it was really funny going back and watching my last podcast episode, because I hadn't realized how skeptical I was of this top when I made it, and how the contrast between how unsure I was when I was knitting it and how happy I am with it now is intense, because I am obsessed with this thing. Oh my goodness. I've been wearing it all summer. This is seriously one of my favorite summer items I've ever worn, or made, really, or worn. Just, I love this thing. So if you want to hear all about my issues with the top, feel free to head over to the last episode. But now that it's done, the material is so lovely and light and airy, and it's so good for summer. It's just beautifully cool, which is what you want in a summer top anyway. The yarn and the yardage issues worked out fine. It is a good length at the end of the day. I just kept knitting until I ran out of yarn, essentially, and the length worked out perfectly. I did stretch it a little bit vertically when I was blocking it, and that also worked out fine. And yeah, it's just beautiful and light and airy, and I love it. So the yarn was Tin Line from Sandus Garn. You can buy it in Australia. I bought it in the States, but I will find a link for you. And yeah, I just found it really interesting because people talk a lot about being process knitters versus product knitters, which basically means, do you knit for the actual making process and the knitting process, or do you knit for the final object to wear or use? And I've always fallen more on the process sides of things. I like knitting for the fun of it, and I do really often want to have something usable and wearable at the end of the day, but even if I don't end up loving the final object, I do still enjoy the making process. But this top was really interesting in that it's the first time that I really disliked the process, but I love the product enough that I would be okay going back and working through the pain of it again. Because I just want to make all the summer tops out of this yarn. And even though I didn't love knitting with it, I really love wearing it. So I will probably end up making at least one more top out of this yarn. So the next set of projects I have are my Stitch Mysteries. And so we are going to move into crochet territory for a little while. So feel free to just skip ahead through this tree part and also the next part about the skirts, because I'm going to be talking about crochet. If that's not your jam, just skip forward to the knitting. So I found it really funny watching my last episode back because I was like, I might make some more of these trees. I'd already made one at that point. I ended up making another 4. I just got really into making these trees. So the pattern is called Stitch Mystery. I think it's just called Stitch Mystery. It's by the Sweater Collective, who is an Aussie designer. And the pattern is free, so I'll put a link to it down below. The yarn was all Bendigo Woolen Mills, Luxury or Classic in 8-ply, which was just stash yarn that I had from some previous Christmas projects that I was doing. Now, the pattern's written to use 8-ply held single, but I ended up using it held double, which ended up with a really nice big tree. And also, it meant that I could play with some colour marling, because for some of the trees I held 2 strands together, which ended up with this really nice like marling effect. So for the trees that were marled, I made the body in the 2 strands of different colours held together, and then for the leaves, like the twirl that goes around the edges, I just used one single colour held double, so it made it a little bit more coherent looking, I think, because I think if it was all marled it would be a bit too busy. I think the main learning that I have from making these trees is that I just forgot how much more yarn crochet takes than knitting. Crochet just like eats yarn, because after knitting for so long and designing and stuff, I have a general sense. If I look at some yarn, I can be like, oh, okay, I'll be able to make this much out of it, or I'll be able to make a top out of it, or like, whatever. And so I looked at this pile of yarn that I had, and I was like, cool, I can easily make 5 Christmas trees of that size. And no. That ended up not being true. I did actually end up finishing the trees, but I had to take a couple of shortcuts here and there. The frills on some of the later trees, they ended up being a bit more spaced out. And I also ended up making the frill a little bit thinner. So it's meant to be, I think, a half double crochet for the frill, but I ended up just doing a single crochet for some of them, just to end up trying to make the yarn go a little bit further. I don't think it ended up looking bad. If you put them all next to each other, you can sort of tell, but each of the trees was going to a different recipient, so you can't really tell anyway, and they still look good. The funny thing about it though is that I looked at this pile of yarn. I was like, I'm going to make 6 trees. And I had all of the recipients in my head for who was going to get a tree. And then I only ended up having enough to make 5. So I didn't end up with one, which was meant to be the whole point at the beginning of making these trees. I wanted to have something to decorate my house with, but everyone was really happy with the trees. Especially because some of the recipients are like between houses at the moment. People were moving around Christmas, so they didn't have an actual tree, so they seemed pretty happy to have them. One of the recipients just immediately hung some ornaments on the tree, which I thought was really cute. And so I will make myself one next year. I already have some yarn picked out in my head. And I might actually make it sooner rather than later, just because it's easier to remember. Since I remember how to make the tree already, it'll be easier to do it now than to wait until Christmas next year. So if you see a random Christmas crochet craft in an upcoming podcast episode, you'll know why. And then the other thing that I made for Christmas are these skirts. So this is a skirt for my daughter. Now, here is a tip for you all. Don't decide to make 3 toddler skirts for Christmas 12 days before Christmas. I don't know what came over me. I was just like, cool, crochet's pretty fast. I can make some gift skirts for my daughter and my nieces. And then I realized pretty late in the game that it was getting very close to Christmas. So I think I cast this on like December 13 or something. And this was the first of 3. So this is the Rara skirt by Sam Hermes. As is pretty standard for me, I ended up using it more as inspiration than an actual pattern. So first off, this yarn up here is Bendigo Woolen Mills Tweed in 8-ply. It's just some yarn that I had in my stash. This speckly yarn here is from Stitchcraft and Wizardry, who are a yarn dyer out in Perth. This is their 8-ply base, and the colorway was called Fun at Reef School, which was a Finding Nemo inspired yarn. I'd had this in my stash for a really long time, and I just wanted to have a go at using it, so I'm really glad that I found a project for it. Now this yellow here at the bottom is Maker DK Double Knitting, which is a 100% acrylic yarn, and I don't love knitting with acrylic, but I actually find it okay crocheting with it, and I figured it would be pretty good for a toddler skirt because it'll hopefully hold up a little bit better. And the purple for my niece's set was Knit Picks Twill in 10-ply. That's 100% wool, but it's machine washable, I'm pretty sure, so it should be okay. Most of the mods were to do with the fact that I was using different yarn weights, because there was some 8-ply in there and there's some 10-ply in there. I'm pretty sure that the pattern is written for 8-ply. So I had to do a bit of experimenting with getting the right amount of increases into the ruffly bits to make it ruffle nicely. Again, crochet eats up so much more yarn than I thought it would. Literally this yellow part here just at the bottom is a whole 100-gram ball. It was so much yarn. I thought I was going to be able to make all of the skirts yellow, and literally I got one skirt out of it instead of 3. So that was a little bit of a shock to the system, and I had to go stash diving for the purple, but I think it worked out okay. But yeah, crochet just uses up so much more yarn than I'm used to. Now, there were a lot of mods. I don't want to go through all of them. If you're interested, I took a lot of notes on my Ravelry project. But the main mod that I do want to talk about is that I actually knit the ribbing band instead of crocheting it. Mostly because I just don't like crochet ribbing. I've never loved how it looks, and it doesn't feel as stretchy as I'm used to with knitting. Plus I was in a rush, so I figured it'd be faster just to knit it because I'm faster at knitting than crochet. It worked out fine, especially because the way that you do the project is that you work the band and then you crochet into the edge of the band to get the layers. And interestingly enough, a knitted bind off looks pretty much like the top edge of a crochet piece. And so it's really easy to crochet into a bind off because it looks exactly like crochet anyway. So where you would stick your hook if you're crocheting is the same as where you stick it into a bind off with knitting. So worked out well. Now, I will say that the girls weren't super into the skirts at the end of the day. I don't know if I've seen any of them wear it except for this photo. But that's okay. I think, with gift knitting, you just have to be happy to have made it, and then whatever the recipient does with it, they do with it, and it's not in your control, right? So if you are thinking of gift knitting, just know that you've got to sort of let go of the fact that the item may or may not be used how you want it to be, and just be happy with the fact that you made it. Okay, back to the knitting. So the next 2 knits that I have are charity knits, which I'm really glad that I got to, because I really am trying to knit more for charity. I said this a little bit in my Everything I Knit in 2022 video, but one of the proudest things that I have from looking back at my FOs from 2022 is how much charity knitting that I did. And so I'm really trying to keep it up because I have so much yarn, I knit so much, I don't really need all of these garments at the end of the day. And if there are people who need stuff more than me, and I'm trying to bust through my stash anyway, I am more than happy to make stuff for other people who actually really need it. The first charity item I knit is a Homecoming Honeycombs beanie. If you've been around here for a while, you have seen this pattern quite a bit. It's a pattern I released in the middle of last year. And the yarn for this one is actually the leftovers from the yarn I used to knit my daughter's beanie. So it's Morris & Sons Estate 8-ply in clay for the sort of solid color. And then the top part of the pinky purple bit is Morris & Sons Quartet, which is also an 8-ply yarn. But then I ran out of that, and so I ended up using the pinky purple section of my ball of Knit Picks Chroma worsted. So that colorway was called Groovy, I'm pretty sure, and it is a rainbow colorway, but it had a long section that was pink and purple, and it worked out perfectly because you really can't tell, I don't think, where that color changes over. So the pinky purple section of the chroma was close enough to the pinky purple color that I was working with that it worked out really nicely. And the yarns themselves are very similar. The composition is very different, but in terms of how they've been spun and their weight and just the feel of it, they're very, very similar yarns. So it worked out really nicely. Now, this was meant to be for an adult. I don't know what I did, but it ended up being really small. This does not fit my head. Weirdly enough, it's even smaller than the beanie that I made for my daughter. So I'm going to donate this next time there's a charity that needs things for kids. The other charity knit that I have is a newborn vertebrae cardigan. Isn't it cute? It's so cute. So this is a pattern by Kelly Van Niekerk. It is a free pattern. So Vertebrae is a cardigan that comes in lots of different sizes, but she's released the newborn size for free. And then if you decide you want to make them for bigger kids or bigger people, then the pattern's paid for. I made this once for Amelia, so I do have a cardigan of hers that I made when she was a newborn, and so I figured it'd be fun to make the pattern again. I sort of impulse cast this on because I was working on some other projects and they were all in a state that needed a little bit of, not maintenance, but like needed a bit more attention. And we were going on a long road trip, and so I wanted something that was just easy stockinette. So I was like, cool, I'll just cast on the cardigan, it's just stockinette. But then I sort of didn't really think about the fact that I'd have to pay attention to the raglan shaping, and then I'd have to split for the sleeves, and I didn't bring any stitch markers with me. So figuring out the raglan without any stitch markers was fun. I just had to keep a pretty careful eye on where my increases were. Pretty sure I didn't get all the stitch counts 100% correct, but it worked out fine anyway. So the yarn is Dragonfly Fibers Damsel, which is the multicolored yarn. And then the yellow is Peyton's Baby Dreamtime Merino 4-ply, which is just 100% merino. Very soft. It's meant to be for babies anyway. So that worked out really nicely. The colours came out really nicely together. I'm not entirely sure what the sizing turned out like because I didn't do a swatch, but the charity just said that they needed sweaters or like cardigans for kids who are under 12 months old. So it didn't have to be too precise anyway. Hopefully this will fit, I don't know, like a 3-month-old. And I was a little annoyed because if you look closely at the yellow, it has gone a little bit blue. So the colour did run when I was blocking it. I probably shouldn't have left it in the bucket soaking for quite so long, but that's a good learning for me. Next time if I have some hand-dyed yarn, I'll just keep a more careful eye on it when it first hits the water, or I'll try throwing some of those colour catching sheets into the bucket with it, especially if I've got two yarns where they might bleed into each other. So the interesting part about this is that the yarn or the pattern is meant to be written for 4-ply yarn, but I didn't realize until after I finished knitting with it that technically the damsel is a 5-ply or a sport weight, but I think it worked out okay anyway. I did measure my usage pretty carefully, so I know now if I'm stash busting later how much yarn it sort of approximately takes to make one of these cardigans. So that'll be helpful info if I want to make some of them in the future. So one mod that I did do that I want to tell you about is that for the button band, well, I guess it's not really button band because there's no buttons, but for this sort of collar edging, usually when you do an edging like this, you do it at the very end. So you knit the whole thing, including the cuffs and this like bottom ribbing section. And then you pick up and you knit around the edge to do this band. And this is true of any cardigan in terms of whether they're kids knits or adults knits or whatever. But what I figured out is that if you end the bottom ribbing on a wrong side row, you can actually immediately go into the button band. So you end on a wrong side row, you do your bind off, and then don't cut your yarn. Just start picking up the stitches along this bottom edge of the ribbing and then the inside of the actual knitted body. And you can just pick up all the stitches and then keep going without having to cut the yarn after the bottom ribbing. And so that was really handy because I hate having extra ends to weave in, and it worked out perfectly. Just picked up the stitches and kept going. So this bottom yellow and then this yellow around edges is just all one continuous piece of yarn. So that's my big tip for cardigans. Then the last FO that I have to show you is what I'm wearing. Oh guys, this is so pretty. Okay, so this is the Gumnut Tee by Mindful Making, who is Jane Barlow. Oh Jane, I'm really sorry if I pronounced your last name wrong. But it's a pattern that was released sometime last year that I tech edited for Jane. And as soon as she published it, well, basically as soon as it landed in my inbox, I knew I wanted to make it. And I also knew I wanted to make it in basically exactly the same colors that she had made it in. So while I was in America last year, I went on the hunt for some yarn. Now, the pattern is written for a merino yarn, but given that it's a summer top, I really wanted to try making it in linen. So I knew I didn't want to work in 100% linen because the yarn, when you're knitting with linen, it can be quite stiff. And so I ended up getting a silk and linen mix. And I meant to bring the ball bands over, so give me a sec, I'll come right back. So I did take a nice picture of the skeins before I wound them up and everything. So I'll post a picture of that here so you can see the colors and stuff. But the yarn was, for the main section, from the Fiber Studio. Now, I've realized recently that the colors blow out a little bit when I try and show you yarn labels. So apologies if you can't actually read this. But it's from the Fiber Studio, who I think were a local company to North Carolina, which is where I bought it from. The base is called Silk and Linen, and it's 65% silk and 35% linen. It's about as luxe as it sounds. It was definitely a luxe price point. So I did splurge a little bit. But the color that I actually wanted was just a basic cream color, but they only had one skein of that. But they also had this sort of neutral, like speckled grey color that really matched very nicely with the other base color. So I got one skein of that as well. And it just turned out beautifully. The colors just melded really well together. I did alternate skeins, which we'll come back to in a bit. And then the two mini skeins I used for the color work, one was from Fairy Tale Yarn Co. And it's just a regular sock base. And that was the lighter brown caramelly color. And then the other one was from Black Cat Fibers. And again, it's their normal sock base. So it's they were both 75-25 merino nylon. Now, I will say that I was worried initially when I looked at the yardage in the pattern because it said you needed quite a bit more yarn than I had in the mini skeins. But when I was done, the mini skeins, like I had plenty left over. So I will talk to Jane about updating that yardage. But if you do try and make this pattern, just know that you can definitely get all of the color work out into mini skeins. I think even in the bigger sizes, because I had plenty left over. So I made a size 2. I wanted a lot less positive ease than they recommended in the top. So the pattern I think you end up with 3 or 4 inches of positive ease, and in my t-shirts I definitely don't want that much positive ease. I tend to go for between 0 and 1 inch of positive ease in the bust. And so the thing was that given that I was substituting such a different yarn, the gauge turned out very differently. So the recommended yarn also recommended like a 4mm needle, but I ended up sizing all the way down to 3.25mm. My gauge was a lot tighter than was recommended in the pattern, and so it worked out perfectly because I made the size 2, which was too big, so when I knitted it at the gauge I was doing it at, then it just made it smaller, and I got the amount of ease that I wanted. Now the pattern tells you at the beginning to cast on the neckline with I can't remember exactly how she phrases it, but it says to use like a tight cast on. And so I used a cable cast on, which is about as tight as you can go. I was doing it in my knitting group, and everyone was a little skeptical of whether I was going to be able to fit this thing over my head, but it worked out perfectly, so I'm pretty happy with how that went. And everything just sort of turned out fine. It looks lovely, fits really well. A couple of tips if you do want to make this in the future. So first off, alternating skeins in the round, I still can't find a method that is reliable for me. I've tried a couple of different things. The reason that I don't like what I did at the end of the day is that it has a pretty visible seam running down the back. So I'll try and show you. Let's see if this shows up on the camera. So I'm not sure if you can see that there, but it was a method. The method that I used was where you just switch skeins at the beginning of every round, and it sounds pretty simple, and it is, and I've used it before pretty successfully, but there was something about this yarn and the tension that I had and stuff that just meant that the seam was quite obvious. I was hoping it would block out, but it didn't really. So I think next time, if I was going to do this, I would do more traditional helical knitting, which is where you sort of chase your yarn around each other. It's really hard to explain, but I'll post a link to a tutorial about helical knitting somewhere, probably down in the description box. And that usually works really well, especially when you've just got stockinette, like I do here. So I probably should have done that. The other option is that next time I will rejig the pattern a little bit so that the beginning of the round is under the arm, because I think if you have like a more visible seam running down the side, it's a little bit more normal to have a side seam, and it's also less visible because it's, you know, in the side. So I'll try that next time probably. Not too fast, it's in the back, still looks fine, so it sort of just looks like I've creased it a little bit. So I think that's okay. The other tips that I have, if you're doing this pattern, the ribbing immediately after the color work suggests that you start with a purl stitch and then a knit stitch, because it's purl one ribbing. I actually had a lot more success doing a knit stitch first and then a purl stitch. It sounds like a subtle change, but it made a big difference to how the color work fed into the pattern, so I like that quite a bit better. Just a tip if it's something you want to experiment with if you're making the top. Also, the tension in the color work is very, very different to the tension in the stockinette. So I actually tried the top on right after the color work, and I freaked out a little bit because it seemed too small. So I will suggest, if you're going to try this on as you're making it, get to the end of the color work, do like, I don't know, a couple of centimeters of the stockinette, and then try it on to see if it's the correct size around your shoulders, because if you try it on directly after the stockinette, after the color work, it's not a good representation of how it's actually going to fit. And yeah, so that's my gum nut tee, and those are my tips for it if you feel like knitting it, because I really do recommend knitting it because it is a beautiful pattern. All right, that is all the FOs. By all, I mean like all 10 of them. So I hope that was fun to listen to, and let's go into the whips. My first whip is Sabo by Needy Knits. I've been mentioning that I wanted to cast on this shawl for a while, but I kept mentioning previously that I wanted to cast on Shuker, which is the smaller version of this shawl. So I went to cast it on, and then I realized that I had enough yardage to make Sabo, which is the bigger version of the shawl. So I went ahead and did that. So I'll post a picture of it here because it doesn't look very impressive on my needles right now, but it is this big, beautiful shawl where you need a lot of garter stitch, but then it has some panels of mohair, like lace weight mohair in the middle of the garter stitch. And so it just makes this beautiful ethereal sort of look to these panels that are scattered throughout the shawl. So I'm making this in Bijou Gobi. So this is from Bijou Basin Ranch, who actually don't sell yarn anymore. But I got this quite a few years ago and I've been looking for something to do with it. So it is a silk and camel mix. So that's the second color that I have. It's this sort of purpley green yellow color. And then the main color that I have is this green right here, which is a bit more solid. And then the final color for the bottom is going to be this purple, which is an entirely different base. But this was something my parents picked up from Copenhagen for me. I got this at Rhinebeck. So all of these yarns are things that have been really special, that have been sitting in my stash for ages, and I'm really glad I found something to do with them. Now, the mohair is from Louie and Lola, who is an Aussie dyer down in Tasmania, and the colorway is called Olive, I think. So it's a very light green, and then it has these cool sort of browny gold speckles in it. So that's going to go with the green. I'm just going to keep using this until it runs out, and when it does run out, I'm going to switch to this just like bare mohair that I picked up from Mel at 3 Cuts Yarn. So those are all the colors, and this is what the beginning of my shawl looks like. I did not gauge swatch, I just went to town because it's just a shawl. So I've gotten this far so far. I've done maybe like 3 of the mohair panels, and it's really hard to show just because it's pretty squashed up on the needles. I probably will switch to a different longer cable pretty soon. But that's what it looks like at the moment. That's probably the best sort of representation I can give you. So it's a beautiful pattern, but I put it down mostly because it's all knit stitches. Because it's garter stitch knit flat, the green sections are all just knitting. And then you sort of stop and do something more complicated to make the mohair panels and to get that shaping. So there's some short rows and some stockinette stitch. But at the end of the day, it was mostly just garter. And my brain just wanted something a bit more complicated to work on because I was working on this and this at the same time, and it was all just sort of like basic garter stitch, basic knitting stitches. So I put this down for a little while because I don't actually need this until the end of March. So I'm going to enter this in the Easter show, which will be a little bit of an adventure, but that's the current plan. If anyone who's not from Sydney, the Easter show is our big sort of agricultural show that happens around Easter time, and they have like a craft exhibition. So I'm going to try that. My friends did freak me out because apparently the Easter show judges are quite particular about how you do all of your finishing and how you weave in your ends and things. And this has a lot of ends because you actually break the yarn after every mohair panel. So you don't break the main color, but you do break the mohair color. So there are a lot of ends to weave in. So I'm trying to be really neat about weaving my ends in. I'm mostly doing the Weave in Steven method, which I will post a link to down below. I will say, if you are wanting to make one of these, I think if you have the budget to make the whole thing in mohair, so as in do the mohair panels as suggested, but for the rest of the shawl, hold the mohair double with the fingering weight yarn, I actually think that would be really good because it means you would be breaking the yarn a lot less. I don't want to go too much into detail about how that would work because it is a paid for pattern, but just trust me, if you can stomach holding the mohair double with the main color, it will make your life a lot easier. But yes, that's Sabo. Now that my gumnut tea is done, I am probably going to pick this up again because I usually try and just have 2 projects on the needles at once. So I'm going to do that. Now, the other project or the other whip that I have right now is my terrain tee. So this is a kit from We Are Knitters, and they very kindly gifted it to me. So thank you to the WAC folks. So I was very confused initially about why these instructions are so long. And then I started flicking through it because it's like a whole book, right? And I realized that the pattern's published in 4 or 5 different languages. So I thought that was really cool. But if you look just at the English section, it's a pretty straightforward pattern. So it is a kit, and it is a kit for the cotton. So We Are Knitters cotton is something that I used a lot. While I lived in the States, We Are Knitters was one of the companies that I used the most yarn from. It was a lot easier to get there than it is here. And I bought it in bulk and I just used it a lot. So it's nice to go back to it. I will say it is different. Now that I've used other yarns, it is quite a bit different to what I'm used to now. So this cotton is probably made up of about maybe like 10 or 12 plies. So, okay. If you're in Australia, this gets quite confusing. It is 10 ply yarn. So that's worsted weight for my friends in the States. But the other definition of ply, if this is something that you don't know, ply also refers to how many individual strands are twisted together to make up a yarn. So it is a 10 ply yarn, but also there are probably 10 or 12 tiny little strands twisted together to make an individual strand of yarn. It might be even more than that. So I don't know if this is going to show up, but if you unwind that a little bit, it has so many tiny little strands that make up this yarn. And I've been finding that my needle catches on them sometimes. So I am having to be a little bit more careful just not to split the yarn as I knit with it. But that's okay. I'm also trying to be a little bit more careful because a lot of this pattern is reverse stockinette, which are purl stitches. So if you look at that there's a lot of purling involved. And I found that if I don't concentrate while I'm purling, my tension ends up being all over the shop. So I'm trying to slow down a little bit and just be more intentional and mindful as I knit this to make sure that I don't end up, it's called rowing out. So if you get your tension wrong when you're working with purl stitches, you end up having really visible rows that are different in like height to the other rows around them, which is what people call rowing out. And I do that a lot. So I'm just trying to be slow and make sure that I do it properly and that it looks even. So this pattern is written in a way that you make 2 panels. So the front panel is this really, really, really cool sort of twisted stitch pattern. And then the back is just slip stitch ribbing. And I will say that the tension for this panel here, because it has so many twisted stitches, if you look at that there, you can actually see, hopefully this shows up in the camera, but you can actually see that the top bit in the stockinette is so much wider than the middle bit with the twisted stitches. So I am a little bit nervous that it might be too small, but the cable-y sort of pattern is hitting right on my waist. So I'm hoping that it's just going to make a nice sort of waist shaping deal and it won't be too tight. So this is the front panel, and then I'm going to finish the back panel And then the reason that it has this sort of different color at the bottom is that I actually changed the pattern a little bit, as usual, and I did a provisional cast on. So if you look at a picture of the actual top, the bottom part of it is like a different type of ribbing. So there's just lots of different textures going on. And it's a very, very long top. So I wasn't sure how long I'd want to make it. And since you knit it bottom up, it's harder to control the length. So essentially what I've done is that I've done a provisional cast on and I've started it just above that bottom ribbing panel. And I'm working up to the shoulders. And then I'm going to do the same thing on the back. And then I'll put the shoulders together and see how long it is. So like I can put it over my head and just sort of like eyeball how long it is. And then that way, once that's done, I'll pick the provisional cast on back up and then work my way down for that bottom ribbing panel. And that way I can control the length a little bit better. So yeah, that's my terrain tee. If you do want to pick up the pattern, it is only available in the kit. I do recommend not getting the needles unless you really don't have any 5mm needles, but I found that I had to size down my needle sizes anyway. So the kit comes with a 5mm needle because that's what's recommended, but obviously everyone's tension is different, so it's up to you if you want to get the needles or not. But if you already have an interchangeable set, it's probably not really worth it. The other thing is that, yeah, like I mentioned, my tension was quite different. So I sized down to a 4.5, and then again, like the gumnut tee, the pattern has a lot of ease in it, and I didn't want that much ease. So it worked out well because my tension is quite a bit smaller than recommended in the pattern. So I'm just making the size 2, which is meant to have about 5 inches of positive ease for me. And hopefully at this tension, I'll end up with something closer to 0 to 1 inches of positive ease. Okay, so the last whip that I have is almost a whip. So if you've been here for a little while, I've been giving updates on a jumper that I'm making for my husband, Wes. It is going to be using a pattern called Porter, which is a big cabled cardigan, but he wants it as a jumper. So I'm going to be making a lot of modifications to the pattern to make it an actual jumper. Now, the yarn that I picked has finally arrived. So this is Wool of the Andes worsted weight, which is a 10-ply yarn. I got both a superwash and a non-superwash. So the main body of the jumper is going to be in the non-superwash because a non-superwash wool I think works a bit nicer for cables. But the superwash is a little softer, so I'm going to use the superwash on the cuffs and also on the big shawl collar. So hopefully it'll be a little bit softer and not as itchy because my husband doesn't love itchy wool. So the color that we finally picked is called Persimmon Heather. Yep. And honestly, it's come out a bit more brown than I thought it was going to. I thought it was going to be a little bit more orange, but I think it looks pretty cool. And I have worked up a swatch. So the pattern asks you to swatch in basket weave stitch, which is just knits and purls, and it's nice and textured. And my gauge is once again a little off. So I used the recommended needle size, which is a 4.5mm needle. And instead of getting 18 stitches and 32 rows, I got 19 stitches and 32 rows. So the length should be fine, but the width is a little bit incorrect. So what I'm going to do is knit the size up, and he wants it to be a little bit more roomy anyway. So I tried to do a little bit of maths. It's hard to do maths very precisely with a pattern like this because the swatch is in one stitch, but then the majority of the pattern and like the jumper is in different stitches, i.e. the cables. So you can get a rough approximation, but you can't be too exact with it. But I think it's going to give him sort of 4 or 5 inches of positive ease, which is what he wanted anyway. I think even in the picture, it's like 6 inches of positive ease. So it should look pretty good. I'm hoping that the sizing comes out right because this is going to be a pretty big undertaking. So if it's not right, we're going to have some issues. So I'm going to be making the size 4 in the pattern. Now, funnily enough, I already cast this on. So I started off and I started with the sleeves because that's what it recommends to do. And so I got about maybe like 2 or 3 centimeters into the cuff before I realized that I was meant to be using the superwash wool and not the non-superwash wool, which is what I had cast on for. So I frogged it all back and then I was going to cast on again, but I realized that there's not too much of summer left, and so I'd rather make one of the t-shirts first, either this one or the terrain tee that I just showed you. And this isn't really needed until the end of March because I'm making it for his birthday and that's when it is. So I put this back on the back burner. At least now I know the needle size and the size that I want to actually do. So I'm all ready to cast on when I'm ready. I think I'm going to finish the terrain tee and keep working on the shawl at the same time as each other. And then when the terrain tee is done, I'll pick up with the cable jumper again. And hopefully that means that by the end of March, I'll be able to finish the jumper and the shawl because they have actual deadlines. So that's all of my whips and FOs. There was a lot there. Hopefully you're still here. And I didn't bore you to death or scare you away with my slightly fast talking. So, the last segment of my podcast is always what's next. So we'll talk about what's happening in the next month or so. I think I gave you a pretty quick outline already of what my actual knitting plans are. So I'm going to be busy with these projects for a while. I may randomly cast on another charity knit. We'll see how we go. But I'll probably only do that if I can think of something quick to make. I am trying to get back onto my normal podcasting schedule, so I will hopefully post at the beginning of March, which means that it's only going to be in like 2 weeks from now instead of the usual month. So it might be a bit of a shorter episode because it'll just be a quick update on the things that I've already showed you today. And then, what else? Honestly, I don't know. Like I said, I'm in between jobs at the moment and I'm trying to stop and have a think about what it is that I want to do. So I'm just taking some time to do that, and I'll see if I end up picking up Oliphant cat stuff up again or if I move into something else. But for now, I'm really lucky, like I said, that I've got the time to just sort of think it through. So I'm going to do that. I do have a couple of other Oliphant cat related things that were already in progress at the end of last year that are rolling out over the next few months. So when those show up still, I will obviously still tell you about it. But other than that, that's basically all I've got for you today. So thank you for sticking around and listening to me talk for the last, I don't know how long this is going to be after I edit it down. Hour or so, 45 minutes. But I hope you had some fun and picked up a couple of tips here and there, or just saw some projects that you liked. If you want details for any of the projects, I will link down to all of the patterns in the yarn and even my Ravelry projects down below. I also send out a monthly newsletter with a roundup of all of this stuff and with all the different links and things. So if you'd rather consume things that way, then there's a link to my newsletter down below. There's also a link to my Instagram, which in the same sort of vein as a lot of the other Oliphant cat stuff, I'm still thinking about how to keep using it. I haven't posted anything on it since maybe the start of December. I think I'm going to slowly come back online with that, but I just need to think through again how I want to do that. And then there's also a link to my Ko-fi account. So if you'd like to shout me a coffee and keep me going with the podcast, I'd really appreciate it. So thanks for watching. Please do hit the like button down below. Leave me a comment just to say hi or to tell me what it is that you're knitting, because I always like hearing what everyone's knitting on, or if there's anything particularly that you liked or you have questions about, shoot me a comment. That really helps Instagram. Oh, I keep saying Instagram. That really helps YouTube to show, know that people are interested and want to show it to other people. But if you are new here and you want to keep following along with the podcast and the things that I've been making, then you can hit the subscribe button right here. And if you want to catch up on any previous episodes of the podcast, there's a playlist of all of them right here. Other than that, I've been Kat from Oliphant Cat, and I'll talk to you in a few weeks. Happy knitting!